I'll just have a chair there in case I need to take a lunch break or something. I sometimes get hungry if I'm rather, excited and, I burn up all the calories that remain. And I'm not as thin as I could be. I think your pastor has beat me on that one. But, you never know if you use them all up. I'm going to switch my glasses a little bit. I have to, depending on how many yards away people are, I've got about 15 different pairs. And I know that they've got varifocals, but I've never been able to get used to that. I kind of fall over myself, trip over my shoelaces. So I just switch specs. I've got one in each pocket and some under here and another pair here and, and a few in the briefcase in case I lose them because I usually sit on them. You find that with glasses? You can spend hundreds of pounds on glasses and you sit on them. And I've never been convinced. I get my glasses at the pound shop. Do you have pound shops, dollar shops, 99? We have a pound shop, a 99 pence shop, a 98.5 pence shop that's trying to undercut. And so if they have glasses and they're a pound a pair, you see. But I'm not Scottish or anything, but a pound seems an awful lot to me. I'll wait till they have a sale, then I can get two for a pound. I get two pairs for a pound. So, and they're not bad. I can sit on them, they bend and they go up and down and all of that. So flexible glasses, it's a good key to keeping your bank balance intact. Anyway, how did we get onto that? Before I so rudely interrupted myself, where were we? Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting this strange gentleman from Britain to speak to you today. But who exactly are you? You may ask. Now, you did get a kind of a genealogical outline, but I was lost at I was lapped by the first post, and I couldn't quite work out the relationships myself. So if I don't know who I am, you don't stand a chance. Don't stand a chance. I am related to the lady I'm sitting to, but she can explain the relationship in great detail. Women seem to understand relationships. In the Second World War, I was evacuated to the north of England, along with about 1 million children from the south of England. And it was a relative, but I could never work out how we were related. My mother's grandmother had a brother who had a sister-in-law who lived up there in Derbyshire, and she had 12 children on the 1,000-acre dairy farm that they had. It wasn't all arable land. It was kind of mountainous and hills and rocks, but it was about a big farm. We went up for a holiday in the war, and my parents said, can we leave him here? The bombs were dropping. And Mrs. Green, Louisa Green, I called her Aunt Louie, said, if you want to, I don't care. You leave him if you want to, take him if you want to. And my parents didn't quite understand that because we had the nuclear family. My sister, a few years older than me, that was it. Mum, dad, sister and brother, the normal small family. Here was a woman with 12 children. And she said, one more pair of hands to do the work, do the milk round, milk the cows, grind up the turnips in the winter for cattle feed. So they left me there. And why am I talking about that? Oh, I'm trying to explain who I am. That was it. But even now, the point is I didn't ever work out the relationship of this lady who became my foster mother during the war years, and I still can't work it out, but I think Tina could explain it. She could probably figure these things out. Women have a knack with these family things, whereas unless it's noughts and crosses or, something like a graph, a man feels more comfortable. There are no emotions involved with a piece of graph paper. They don't have to wrestle with you haven't done this or you haven't done that, and so men like things. The men tend to retire to the pub, don't they, and talk about engines or that's men for you. Good afternoon, everyone. I was born in London in 1935 and in a hospital there in central London. And soon after that, my father landed a job on the outskirts of London, a prime job. He was security officer and a fireman at a large psychiatric hospital. And we had a house in the ground, so How could you fall on your feet better? A job, edge of London, not in the middle, not going to be bombed as much. And on top of that, we could see country from the bedroom windows. And he was security officer and fire officer. He'd been a fireman with the London Fire Brigade. So I had the opportunity with my sister of growing up in the suburbs rather than inner city. Wonderful opportunity, good schools, good education, everything to be thankful for. My early memories, of course, were of the Second World War. Air raid sirens going off night after night after night. My mum and dad waking my older sister and me up about 11 o'clock every night. The sirens would go, the planes were coming, and they would hustle us out of bed, put on my red knitted dressing gown. I can remember that because it was always unraveling. And I thought it was great. I would pull on the string at the bottom and get balls and put the ball in the pocket, and it got shorter and shorter as we'd walk 100 yards down the road to the nearest air raid shelter, and the planes already beginning to appear on the horizon. We would hurry. They'd hustle us down steps into this, what we called an Anderson shelter. I think Anderson was the name of the cabinet minister that had invented these kind of shelters. You dig a hole in the ground, and when it gets to be a fair size, you begin putting pieces of curved corrugated iron on each side, so it forms like a little house, and the dirt you excavated, you then put on top of the corrugated iron and try and have little steps going down. They called them Anderson shelters. And pretty well everybody was building these things, and the nearest one to our house, we didn't build our own. It was just down the road 100 yards. And I can remember the planes flying overhead, just a little kid. The whistling sound as the bombs came down. You'd hear the bombs coming, you'd hear the whistle. They weren't that fast in those days. Sound actually traveled faster than the bomb, 30, 40 miles an hour. So you'd hear the whistle and then the explosion. And they used to seem to come in sticks of three. We call them sticks of three. You'd hear the first whistle and then the explosion, and the house was demolished. And a moment or so later, a second whistle and a second home or building destroyed. And your heart was beginning to pound faster and faster, wondering if the third whistle would be your house. Were you in for the next bomb? It was a very frightening time, even for a little kid and for adults. I remember the safest place in the house, sometimes we didn't make it to the air raid shelter and we dived under the stairs. The safest place in a 2-story house is usually under the stairway because that's heavy wood to hold the stairs. And nearly every home in England that has an upper story in the stairway has a cupboard under the stairs where you keep knickknacks and maybe tools. We put a mattress in there, so it was a bed. Mum and Dad at the high end where the stairs were going up, my sister and me at the other end, so, you went to sleep smelling your mum or your dad's feet, and of course they had to smell yours, and we did that many nights, sleep under the stairs, the safest place. Even if the house had a direct hit and collapsed, the stair would often remain standing. So that was the standard thing in those days, and these incredible memories of the bombs landing. We lived in a town called Epsom. You may be more familiar with it than you realise. It was on the south side of London.Maybe you've used Epsom salts at times. You can put them in the bath for, just cleansing, or you can take them internally if you want to clean out your inside. A lot of salt, and you kind of use the bathroom, that sort of thing. Maybe you've watched the Epsom Derby horse race on TV sometimes, and of course the Kentucky Derby has been named after that, and all the other derbies around the world. It was named the Derby after Earl Derby when the first horse race took place in Epsom on their downs. My wife couldn't understand. Why do you call them downs? Why aren't they ups? The ground. Why isn't the race course on the ups? But they're called the downs. Maybe they call them downs here too. You have downs, a rolling countryside, and the Earl Derby was challenged by another member of the aristocracy who could win a race with young fillies, three-year-old fillies, and they had the first race there on the Epsom Downs, and it's continued ever since the 1700s. And you could see the race course, not the actual course, but you could see the grandstand where people would watch from my bedroom window and my parents' bedroom window in our house there in Epsom. So you couldn't see the race. It was a couple of miles away, but I could look out the window and see the grandstand. And as I got older in school, I'd cycle up to the races, lean my bike against the white rail and watch the horses go by on Derby Day and some of the other days. You can't do that now. The whole racecourse is surrounded by hospitality, tents that you pay thousands for, and, you wine and dine if you've got clients for your business. So you can't go up and watch for free as I used to in my school days. But some of those are the memories of Epsom for me. That was where my schooling was. And although I'd gone to Sunday school a few times when I was younger, when I was up there in Derbyshire on this 1,000-acre cow farm, you don't call it a cow farm, milk farm, dairy, you know what I mean, dairy farm. I'm not really a farmer. But even though I'd had that experience there, I'd gone to Sunday school there. All the boys were packed off to Sunday school on Sunday simply because Mum and Dad wanted to have a snooze Sunday afternoon. They wanted you've got 12 kids, an hour or two's relief is well worth, finding a Sunday school for. So I'd been to Sunday school. In fact, I used to go to 2 or 3 to find out which you could get the most from. The regular Methodist Sunday school that we would go to, this is when I was 8, 9, 10 years of age, the young teacher there had a system where he would ask us to find a Bible verse, and the first one to find it would sometimes get a penny. So that was exciting. That was a great Sunday school. And another one I went to, they had refreshments afterwards, so that was worth going to as well. So I did have a knowledge of what religion was all about. I knew Christianity meant a penny when you could find a verse and refreshment sometimes at the end of the service. So I wasn't an ignorant when it came to religion. I knew a lot about it. But by the time I was 12 or 14, I no longer went near a church. Most people in Britain never did. I mean, Britain isn't the most religious kind of a country. I don't think that people are more or less immoral. It's just that they're not necessarily religious. Some people, religion's part of their DNA, and in Britain it generally isn't. In the 1950s, when I was going to secondary school, high school, we called it grammar school. I know grammar school here means younger, but in Britain it tends to mean an academic type of school. And at that time, about 8 or 9% of the population in Britain probably went to church. So over 90% didn't. And in the school I went to, there were very few that I knew that went to church. I was studying science. I wanted to be a science teacher, and there were a few boys in the school that went to church, and they all seemed to end up being my friends. I don't know how that worked out. 4 or 5 lads that were churchgoers, and they were interested in science too, and, we just palled around as youngsters do. I remember that vividly. One of my friends had started going to the Salvation Army. We would walk to school together, and he would try to, tell me all about the Salvation Army. I felt a bit uncomfortable. He'd say, "Are you saved?" And I didn't know what that meant. But whatever it was, it seemed decidedly unsavory to me. And have you been saved? He said, I went up to the altar rail on Wednesday night or whatever, and I wasn't even quite sure what an altar rail was. But I kept my distance. I didn't get too involved in his evangelism. Then another friend I had was a Methodist, and he would tell me about their youth club and how they'd saved up to buy a new front piece for the church. They had a kind of a table with a lovely tapestry on, a kind of an altar, and a cross that they put on either the wall behind or on the table that glowed in the dark. And that was the young people thought this was great, but then some of the older people in the church complained. They didn't like a glowing cross that sort of winked or whatever. It did. And so they were conflicted. He was asking me, what do you think? Should we have bought a glowing cross that, beams and I didn't know. I had no idea about it. Should it or shouldn't it blink? I didn't know. Another friend I had was a keen member of the Church of England. We used to play tennis together, and he would tell me why he thought the Church of England was the one true church. Now, I wasn't convinced by his arguments, but my curiosity was aroused. I was beginning of these different churches. They all had a different take on things. That while we were playing tennis one day, he said, I've met a girl. I said, oh, yes. She's a nice girl. Oh, yes. I've started dating. Oh, yes. She's a Catholic. Well, I think I knew what a Catholic was. I'd heard arguments about mixed marriage. And mixed marriage in those days had nothing to do with your ethnic background. It was to do with whether you were Catholic or Protestant. This is the 50s. Some people were against mixed marriages. Some people were in favor of mixed marriages. Some said it's bound to cause trouble. Others said, well, but they're both Christian, you see. So anyway, he'd met this girl, and she was Catholic. And so as we would play, and all this, he'd say, on the one hand, she's a Christian and I'm a Christian. On the other hand, if you're a Catholic, you've got to bring your children up as Catholics. So do I want that? On the other hand, there's some problems with Catholic doctrine. They say the Pope has always been the top dog in the Christian world, but historically he was an historian. He loved history, got A's in history, wrote papers on history at school. He said historically, you go back, and before 400 AD, the Pope wasn't the top prelate in Christianity. Each city had its bishop, and they were all kind of equals. Some may have been a bit more equal than others, but basically Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Rome, they all had a bishop, and one didn't tell the others what to do. So he was constrained. On the one hand, this rather nice-looking girl. On the other hand, his history passion, and he couldn't kind of marry. So I'm giving you this to see how I began to get curious about the Bible and about Christianity and all these different arguments from my friends. And I began to wonder, why do all these churches teach different things? I was just a bit puzzled from my kind of scientific point of view. I started to visit different churches every Sunday, sometimes 2 or 3 different churches on the same day. One service in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. Sometimes I'd drop in at a Sunday school. I was very interested in all of this, and I would hang around after the service to talk to the minister if I got a chance. Often they would shake hands at the door, and when the last person went out and he was relaxing and going to get a quick whatever they got, cuppa or maybe a beer, I don't know, but I would be hiding behind a pew or something, and I'd pop out with some questions. I gave him a bad time. I'm sorry about that. But I also started to listen to some of the religious radio programs. We didn't have much religion on the BBC. We had a religious section to the BBC. They had a man in control of religion, and every week there'd be a service from a different church. And that was about it. About an hour and a half or 2 hours of religion a week was all you had on BBC, because most people weren't that interested. But I found on Radio Luxembourg they had religious programs imported from the USA. One night it was Oral Roberts from Tulsa, not that far from here. Another night it would be Frank and Ernest. Well, Frank, what do you think happens when you die? Now, that's a very interesting question, Ernest. What about this? What about that? And, I was intrigued. Frank and Ernest are they're kind of a break-off from the Jehovah's Witnesses, as you know, one of the Dawn Bible Students Association. And then another evening, it was the Seventh-day Adventist program, The Voice of Prophecy. And they would have a young male quartet sing, "Coming again, Jesus is coming again." And then there was the Mormon hour, and then there was Billy Graham with the Hour of Decision. And I'd listen to all these programs, and again, I think, well, they've all got a little different angle. So, I found this quite curious and of interest. And again, after the weekly services that I went to in different churches, I'd ask the minister why they taught certain things and why they didn't teach other things. Why didn't the Salvation Army practice communion? Why didn't they have a service with bread and wine? I thought all churches had services with bread and wine. They called them by different names, but the Salvation Army didn't do it at all. And I was a bit puzzled about that. Why didn't the Quakers practice baptism? Didn't everybody, all these Christians, didn't they all believe in baptism? I mean, everybody got christened in England, whether they went to church or not, in the 40s. It began to drop off in the 50s, and today, relatively few are christened. But at that time, it was the normal thing. Why didn't the Quakers have baptism? Even Jesus got baptized. So why wouldn't the Quakers? I couldn't figure that one out. And I'd ask the people, and some of them said, well, we don't really know. The Quakers said, yeah, well, that's just, our church doesn't do it. Why not? Well, we've never done it. That was it. Didn't really know the reason. Why were a lot of the evangelical churches quite happy to go into a court and take an oath? I swear by Almighty God, I tell the truth, whole truth, and so on, when Jesus said, don't swear at all. Don't take an oath. Let your yea be yea and your no be no. Speak the truth. The minute you say, I swear by my chin, or, I swear by this, he said, don't swear by the heaven or by the earth. It's just God's footstool. If you have to say, I swear by this, what's wrong with your normal speech and language? Do you not normally tell the truth? So I wondered about these things. Why do these churches, do take oaths? At the Baptist church, both of the ministers' sons were in the Air Force. And I asked the church secretary there, this is all the churches in Epsom, about 50, 60 churches, some little ones, some bigger ones, but they represented most of the major denominations in the world. And so I was working through all of them. And I said, well, didn't Jesus say we weren't to hate and we weren't to kill? Didn't he say we were to love our enemies? Wouldn't that mean you can't go into the military, you see? And the church secretary said, well, I think you may have a point there. Maybe we shouldn't go into the military. And my concern was, how can you press a button in the plane and drop a bomb and you're going to kill women, children, old people, grandparents, all folks? No, you can't discriminate when you drop a bomb on a city. So I was just trying to reconcile these things. Now, I've changed my mind on a lot of these things over the years, sometimes several times, back and forth. But these were things I puzzled about. You see, that's what I'm trying to explain. I'm not trying to set out a doctrinal position. But I thought, how can we drop bombs on grandmums and granddads who are supposed to love? Jesus said, surely, we shouldn't do it. And the church secretary actually said, well, I think I agree with you here. A Christian really shouldn't do these things. But that isn't what the Baptist church teaches, I said. The minister's sons are in the forces. And he said, well, yes, I know, but there's nothing we can do about it. This is what the church teaches. We all have to just fit in. Well, I was surprised how candid many of these ministers and church officials were that I spoke to. Many said, yes, I know some of the things we teach are not in the Bible. And there are things that we don't teach that are in the Bible. They could see that. And I was rather surprised they were very candid with me. But many of them said, yes, but, I've been a minister in this church for many years and I've changed my ideas as the years have passed, but I've got a wife and I've got family and a house. I've got to pay the mortgage. I've got to family. What can I do? I just fit in. So that was a kind of a bit of a revelation to me, how many people inevitably, however zealous and principled they might have been as teenagers, as they got older, they had to fit the mold. And they didn't want to rock the boat. So I could sort of see that, but it didn't satisfy me. I was a few months from graduating from my grammar school, my secondary school, my high school. It was early 1953. And a boy in my class who knew about my interest in these religious radio programs came up to me and he said, I've heard a very unusual radio program. I think you'd be interested. It's called The World Tomorrow. And it was on Thursday afternoon. So I charged home from school that week and hurried home. And for the first time, I heard The World Tomorrow program. And just a few weeks earlier, Radio Luxembourg, the most powerful station in Europe at the time, just a few weeks before, they'd opened up their programming to the World Tomorrow program. Mr. Armstrong had actually applied in 1952, and I think the first tape we sent was rejected for one reason or another, and I think he sent another program. He redid it because they had some objection, and then they rejected that too. I think some technical specification, it failed. And so it was several times, and he finally submitted. So he didn't plan the time when we began. He finally submitted a tape, and it was accepted and went out the first Thursday there in 1953. And a week or two later, I started listening. So I can vividly remember here was a man reading the Bible, and saying we must do what God says. And I'd never really heard that before, put in those basic terms. I can still remember the first 2 radio programs. They made such an impact. I'd never heard anyone explaining things quite this way. And I was trying to put the program into a pigeonhole. Was he a Mennonite? Was he a Jehovah's Witness? Was he an Adventist? Was he a I couldn't find where to slot him in. And that kind of frustrated me a little bit. What was he? Was he religious? Maybe he wasn't religious. Maybe he wasn't a church. He would mention his son, Garner Ted Armstrong. He mentioned, and now we're going to take a break, and my daughter, Beverly Armstrong, is going to sing from the Messiah. And then I wrote for the Plain Truth magazine. I got a magazine. Here was an article by Herman Hay. And then I saw another article by Kenneth Herman. And I thought, Armstrong, Herman. Maybe this is a big family. Maybe it's just all a family. That's all it is, this religion. Anyway, I was curious about these things. And it wasn't like any of the 50 or so denominations that I'd been studying up to that time. The program was only once a week, but I listened avidly and checked everything in my own Bible. And now what I didn't know back then, at the beginning of 1953, was that 5,000 miles ago, in the heart of the Midwest, on a farm near Columbus, Nebraska, a young woman had also just started listening to the World Tomorrow radio program. Shirley Engelbart, who in less than 10 years would be my wife. She had 2 younger brothers, Guy, a year and a half younger, and Ozzie, 8 years younger. Ozzie Engelbart, who some of you, I'm sure, have known in the past. He hasn't been with us for 19 years now. Within a few years, Guy and Ozzie would both be in the ministry of the Radio Church of God. And so would I. I didn't know that then when I started hearing that program. And of course, Ozzie and Tina were in this area for 9 years. Tina's still here, but I mean as a minister, quite a long period of time. Shirley had an assignment in high school. They had to do a research project. Shirley was a straight-A student. She was very smart, much smarter than me. And she always got straight A's, except the last year she had to take typing. And she found she was challenged with typing. She sweated and sweated and sweated, hated it. But fortunately, she learned to type. But she got a B in typing. So instead of being valedictorian, the one after that, what do you call it? The next stage. So she still got a scholarship to Wayne State Teachers College and maybe to another university, but she came number 2. But she had this assignment, a research project, and she decided to do a research project on the origins of Christmas and the Christmas customs. She thought that would just getting near Christmas time. She thought that would be a good subject. As she studied the Encyclopedia Americana and the Encyclopedia Britannica, she said to her mum and dad, all these customs are pagan, every one of them. It was a shock to the whole family, but Christmas was pagan. She got an A for her research paper. Within just a few days, a voice came over the airways. The subject of the program was Christmas, into their Nebraska home, talking about all the pagan customs. And Shirley said to her mum and dad, everything this man is saying is true. I've just completed this paper, and everything he's saying is true. And their ears picked up, and from then on, they were hooked, and they listened to those programs. They became regular listeners to the World Tomorrow program. Shirley went on to study at Wayne State College in northeast Nebraska, And then, of course, she qualified as a teacher. She taught in a one-room country schoolhouse, about 14 or 15 youngsters, every age from 5 up to 14. So it's quite demanding if any of you have done that. But what has all this got to do with the price of putty? Some of you are beginning to wonder. What on earth has all this got to do with me, with us here today on God's Sabbath day? Well, first of all, I was explaining a little bit to you about me, this strange Englishman who you've invited to speak to you in your fellowship. But I'm also covering a little of the history of the way this work that we're a part of developed. We find ourselves a part of a very unusual history. And history is very important. We live in nations, America and Britain today, that are in danger of forgetting their history. Back in the book of Deuteronomy, God tells ancient Israel, our ancestors, to be very careful. Deuteronomy chapter 4, God is telling ancient Israel, whatever you do, do not forget the past. God explains that there's an important part of our lives that should be concerned about where we came from, what our ancestors lived through, their experiences. In fact, the entire book of Deuteronomy is really a history lesson. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9. We're going back here to Deuteronomy chapter 4. And here, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9, we read, and Moses is rehearsing. They're just before they go into the promised land. They've been 40 years in the wilderness, escaped from Egypt in the wilderness. Now they're about to enter the promised land, and Moses says, look, you need to know where you've come from. You need to go know the experiences you went through. Don't forget, because it keeps you anchored. It gives you moorings. It gives you a direction in life. If you don't know where you've come from, you probably aren't going to arrive where you want to go. And so book of Deuteronomy, rehearsing all of the events of especially the last 40 years in the wilderness. Verse 9, he says, only take heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently. You need to put out effort when it comes to this. Lest you forget the things your eyes have seen. Lest you forget your history. Lest these things, it says these things depart from your heart all the days of your life. Remember these things. And teach them to your sons and your sons' sons. This is Deuteronomy 4, verse 9. So God is telling us here, it's so important, it's so vital to pass on your history, your own life, your parents, grandparents, why you're the way you are, why you think the things you do, why you believe what you do. Pass that on to the next generation and the next generation. You know, we often joke, the only thing we learn from history is that men and women learn nothing from history. That's the one thing we can be sure about. And we also say men and women who do not learn from the lessons and mistakes of history are destined to repeat them. And that happens generation after generation after generation. Here in Deuteronomy 4, a few verses further down, verse 23, Deuteronomy 4, verse 23. Take heed to yourselves, Deuteronomy 4, verse 23. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget. What might they forget? For them, ancient Israel, they'd come out of slavery in Egypt. They had discovered a new life. Freedom had been born on earth from a world where most people enslaved anyone they could. Anyone who could be enslaved would be enslaved. We sometimes hear about what they call revisionism and people apologizing for the past. I'm sorry that 500 years ago, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather maybe did something to somebody. You can't do that. You can't apologize for somebody else. It's easy, isn't it, to say, I apologize for something which happened in 1066 when William the Conqueror came across. I can say, I apologize for that. But it doesn't mean a thing. It doesn't cost me anything to say that. I don't quite understand this apology for the past. Now, if I did somebody wrong, I need to apologize for that. But people forget. People say, well, I was made a slave. Well, so was I, my family. And many years ago, the Israelites were enslaved by the Africans. That went on for centuries. Most people on earth have been enslaved by somebody because basically power wins, doesn't it? And if you can take over somebody else's wealth and potential and energy, you do. That's human nature, I'm afraid. Well, ancient Israel had come out of slavery in Egypt, and they discovered a new life. Freedom had been born. They had come face to face with God and lived to tell the tale. They'd come face to face with God's wonderful way of life, face to face with his commandments, face to face with his covenant. You obey me, I'll protect you. Verse 23, same chapter, chapter 4, verse 23. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 23. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget. Don't forget where you've come from. Don't forget the lesson you've learned. Pass them on. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you. In Exodus, back in the book of it, we're not going there right now, but I'm just reminding you, in Exodus, you read about the Ten Commandments, and Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23, and in chapter 23 and chapter 24, it's all summed up, and Moses says, we're going to make this covenant. God is going to make a covenant with us. And the people said, whatever God says, we will do. And God said, you obey me, and I will protect and bless you. So that's what we call the Old Covenant there in Exodus 22, especially chapter 24, where it culminates and where blood is spread and picturing what Jesus would eventually do. So God basically had said to Israel, you obey me and be my special people. I will protect and bless you, my special nation. But the fact remains, even though God said, don't forget, nearly all of us tend to forget. Even the name given to this great nation, the United States, Manasseh, means forget. Maybe God knew something that we haven't always wised up to. God told them here, whatever you do, don't forget your history. But Ephraim and Manasseh did forget who they were, and today they don't know. Today, Britain and the United States no longer know who they are. The nations through whom God is working out his great purpose here on earth. Isaiah 46, verse 9 tells us the same thing. Isaiah 46, verse 9. It's another context, I know, and I'm not going to read all the context. It's much too long for today. But basically there, in Isaiah 46, verse 9, God says, remember where you've come from. In Isaiah 46, God is saying, remember your history. Isaiah 46, verse 9. Remember the former things of old, God says. Isaiah 46, verse 9. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is none else. I am God, and there is none like me. You often hear the Shema mentioned. The Lord your God is one Lord. And people argue about it. God is one Lord. Is he 14 or 13 or 20? And when I don't, so people get into theological arguments about this. The Lord our God is one Lord. And it's really a complete misunderstanding. The Hebrew word echad can mean one, or it can mean alone. It's fairly broad, as so many of our English words are. And all that is saying is, I, the Lord God, am God alone. All these gods of Egypt, all these gods of other nations, they're no gods at all. It is me, Yahweh, the Eternal One. I am God alone. That's what it's saying. It's not a numeracy. It's not a mathematics course. That verse has got nothing to do with mathematics. You see that I'm God alone, the true God that created all. Anyway, how did I get onto that one? I keep interrupting myself, but that's the way it goes. Verse 9, remember the former things of old. I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me. So we need to remember, God says, the way God has dealt with us in our lives. We need to understand the way he has opened our minds, to understand his truth. The way that God has used this work that we are a part of, that we find ourselves involved in. We need to see the hand of God in the history of this work and also in our own history, how God has worked with us from who knows when. Maybe he had you picked out when you were just a little squirming infant, bubbling away at both ends. Maybe God had you picked out when you hadn't been born. Maybe God had you picked out when you were only a twinkle in your daddy's eye. Who knows? Who knows? But God is telling us, don't forget the way he has worked with us through the years. Now, where were we before I interrupted myself for the 14th time in one sermon? This must be a record. I think it was with Shirley teaching in a one-room country schoolhouse in Nebraska. Meanwhile, back in England, I had worked around the country, different activities for several years, and then I also studied to be a teacher in a college affiliated to London University. All the time, Shirley and I, far away, continued to study our Bibles and listen to the World Tomorrow radio programs, and by now Shirley knew that she should be keeping the Sabbath. She had a conscience. And she was bothered. She was teaching at school and doing a normal routine, but she knew she had to go to Ambassador College, the church college in Pasadena, California. Now, her family weren't sure about it, and even Shirley wasn't completely sure. Maybe this is some charlatan. Maybe you'll get out there and find that it's a sham. If so, jump on the train and come right home. We'll help you with the fare to get back. So Shirley headed to the train station with Brother Guy. He's up there living on the slopes of Mount Rainier, just outside Seattle. That was his last pastorate, but he still lives there. And his wife, Penny, doesn't have the best of health, so he's helping her at the present time. But Guy took her to the Columbus railway station, and as she got on the train and her trunk went on that train that was going to travel more than she'd ever traveled in her life, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to the west coast, Guy's last words were, Shirley, whatever you do when you get out to that college, whatever you do, don't marry a preacher. And she said, Guy, of all the stupid ideas, I would never, ever do a thing like that. What happened to Guy and Ozzy and Shirley? They became preachers and she married a preacher. Although I wasn't at the time. I wasn't ordained till a couple of years later. Anyway, all this time we were studying the Bible. 2 years later, she started in 1956. 2 years later, 1958, I started at Ambassador, 1958, the second Englishman to come to the campus there in Pasadena. We had just acquired the largest portion of the campus at that time. Hewlett C. Merritt was the steel millionaire, and he had a property there we called Ambassador Hall, which we used as classrooms for the students. And that had become available the previous summer, and the question came up, what should we do about it? Mr. Armstrong, I think, was in England at the time briefly, and he got a phone call. This property has become available. And most of the faculty members, like Rod Meredith and other Herman Hay, and they thought, well, why would we want a great big building like that? Why would we want to take people's tithe money and buy this building? And Mr. Armstrong said, we need that property. Well, look, I don't remember whether it was auction but somehow we got involved in the purchase. $100,000. $100,000. Now, I don't know about here, but in Britain, you could buy a nice chicken coop for about that in the London area. A basic tiny apartment is about £300,000 or £400,000. So 100,000. There was a lovely wall around that property, around the grounds. You've seen these trees, the fir trees going up to Ambassador Hall, and then the ornamental lake on the other side. And around that whole property is a nice wall, lots of little kind of Queen Anne legs and a balustrade all the way round. It would have cost more than $100,000 just to build that wall. And nobody wanted it. Here was a big stately home on South Orange Grove Avenue. You'd need a fortune. You'd need a retinue of attendants and gardeners to look after a place like that. And it was zoned. You couldn't just turn it all into little apartments. So nobody could buy it. And we had the areas immediately next to it, bought it for $100,000. When I arrived, they were just converting it into a classroom building. And so I had my freshman Bible class in Ambassador Hall. I remember that vividly. Anyway, back to the story. Back to 1956, when Shirley went to Ambassador College. We had about 1,000 members in the church at that time, but they were going each year to the Feast of Tabernacles, and most of the 1950s we were meeting at Big Sandy, just close to Tyler and Longview and Gladewater in East Texas. And in fact, that year, I think 56, we had about 1,900 people attending the Feast of Tabernacles there in Big Sandy. In England, that summer of 1956, Mr. Armstrong had a 2-week campaign in central London, and a few people became very interested, and a small church was started, summer of 1956. It was the 16th church in the world. We used to give a number to each church, 001, 002, and London was 016, number 16. Still has that number. Many churches still have these numbers tacked on. A small number, just about 10 or 12 people, began keeping the Sabbath and had a regular service or study each Sabbath. For the first time, there were people who wanted to keep the feast beyond the boundary of the United States in London. Now, in those days, there were hundreds of people writing in about baptism, responding to the radio program. We would send out senior students in pairs, just as Jesus did. You remember in Luke chapter 10, we won't read there, I think you're familiar with it. He took 70 and sent them out 2 by 2. And wherever you go, preach the gospel, heal the sick, baptize, and so on. And they were all very excited about it. We did the same thing. We sent out pairs of students, and hundreds were baptized every summer. Now, those people had no local church to attend. We only had about a dozen churches in the whole of the United States. That's about one church for every 4 or 5 states. So none of those people, except on very rare occasions, were able to get to a Sabbath service. There was no teaching, no fellowship. Many would go to the Feast of Tabernacles after they'd been baptized that summer, but would go home and with no help or fellowship would fall away. That was what happened. In the 1950s, every year, about a half of our members would fall away. Of those who went to the Feast of Tabernacles, half would never come back. Well, some may have come back after a few years, but we take a hand raise at the Feast of Tabernacles every year. The number of people being baptized on these summer tours was so great that the total number still grew, 30% a year. We would say, how many are here for the first time? And 2/3 of the audience would put their hands up. Only 1/3 had been there the year before. Of the 2/3 that would have been there, half had fallen away. But with so many hundreds being baptized, we would still grow 30% a year through the 1950s. In 1956, when my wife attended Ambassador College, as I mentioned, about 1,900 keeping the feast there in Big Sandy. In 1957, the old redwood building we had that would later become a student library was outgrown. They didn't have sides on the building, and the crowd just flowed out the sides of that building. And if it was cold weather or the inclement weather, that was very difficult to give sermons. So in 1958, that was the year I came to Ambassador, the decision was made to build a new auditorium, the Tabernacle we called it. We bought it from the Balaam Manufacturing Company in Columbus, Nebraska, where my wife got the train to go to Ambassador College, the Balaam Manufacturing Company. They had a new type of construction, steel construction, a building where no pillar or post would be needed. Large buildings, the walls were corrugated. So there was a lot of strength in the walls. And the corrugations were corrugated. So even the corrugation was corrugated. Tremendous strength in the walls. When you built the walls and the roof, what you needed was a retaining bar to hold that wall in so the weight of the roof didn't push it out. And you could have a huge building without a pillar or post. Mr. Armstrong liked that idea. He said everybody would get a direct view of the speaker. And we thought, we'll build it big. We'll build it big so it'll last several years. We'll build a building that will take 4,000 people. That was the idea. So we built that steel and aluminium building, and we called it the Tabernacle. We thought it would last a while, but we still planned ahead. Mr. Armstrong was always looking ahead. It could be expanded. You could build on at the end, take the wall down, go out another 50% larger. So instead of 4,000, it would be able to hold 7,000. And then if necessary, it could be doubled in width. So it could seat 13 to 14,000. And then you could put a balcony in for another couple of thousand. Well, we knew that would be the biggest we'd ever get. It could hold maybe 13, 14, 15, maybe 16,000. And we knew then we'd never get that big. Remember, half of the church fell away every year. And as we got bigger, you had less control, as it were, not control, but less opportunity to really teach people. So we figured the numbers falling away would about balance those coming in. We thought 10, 15,000 max would be the most the church would ever be worldwide. Every year, more men were graduating from Ambassador College in Pasadena. More young men were being ordained, and we were establishing more local churches, almost imperceptibly, without realizing it. In the later 50s, we had churches springing up around the United States, and people that were baptized in the summer and went to the feast at Big Sandy could go back and get, within a couple of hours, they could reach a local church, maybe one only 200 miles away. So in 3.5 hours, they could be there. So we began having these local churches around the country, and more remained faithful. And the numbers at the feast grew. 1957, about 2,700 came. 1958, the year I came to Ambassador College, the Tabernacle was full. The large building we built was packed with 4,000 people. Immediately the feast was over, we started ripping down the end wall to expand it so that it could take 7,000. Maybe that would be good for years to come. 1960, we began to think outside the box. Numbers are increasing every year. People are having difficulty traveling from Canada, from long distances. Maybe we need a second location. We'd always thought, God said where I place my name, so one place for the feast. But here, I see the time's moving along, so I'll wind up. Here, we realized that the numbers weren't slowing down. We needed another location. And would that be right according to the Bible? We'd already established a precedent. We were meeting in London. We'd had this campaign in London. We had a Feast of Tabernacles in London, so it wouldn't be wrong to have another location. So we opened Squaw Valley in 1960. And that year, about 9,000 people kept the feast. And so it went on, year by year. Meanwhile, back at the college in Pasadena, more applicants were coming in from abroad. We needed a college in Europe. Raymond McNair in the United Kingdom had gone to estate agents, and we got stuff coming in showing property that might be available for a college. And there was one property close to the middle of London, the only thing that seemed reasonable, not that big, maybe a men-only college where men could be trained for the ministry. Mr. Armstrong was about to return to the United States, and a letter came to Raymond McNair, a property on the outskirts of London, not a building that we'd been looking for, but an entire estate. And he said to Mr. Armstrong, maybe we should go and look at this. So Mr. Armstrong said, okay, let's go out and be there an hour before the appointment so we can check it out before the estate agent comes. And they found this property on the outskirts of London, on the northwest, where the college in Bricketwood was eventually established. And Mr. Armstrong stood there among the weeds that were hip high. We saw the stately home and the sunken garden and the rose garden and the Japanese gardens and the little stream going through the grounds. He said, God wants us to have a co-ed college just like Pasadena, where young men and women can learn together in cultural surroundings and meet and marry. And so we entered into negotiations with the estate agent, Mr. Pelham. I remember him, 1959 this was, the autumn of 1959. He'd sold off every available bit of the property that was saleable, every reasonable house that you could sell off, and he was left with a stately home and a couple of 100 acres of grounds and outbuildings. And it was the Greenbelt outside London. No building was permitted, hardly any changes unless it was for agricultural reasons. What could this property be used for? A hospital, maybe? Or a college? Nobody could afford to live in a home like that these days, where you'd need a retinue of servants. A college. Yes, that would be possible. The local council said you could use this for a college. It was unsaleable. Mr. Pelham said you can have it for £8,000. £8,000. Maybe a rabbit hutch. I don't know. Unbelievable. You couldn't have even bought a couple of apartments in those days for that price. So we had that gorgeous stately home, all the outbuildings, everything. It had a kind of a concrete formed wall, just like the one around Memorial, around Ambassador Hall in Pasadena, all around the campus. And you couldn't have built that wall for £8,000. So once again, you see the hand of God working things out beyond our control. We've got troubles in our own lives, and we wonder, how am I going to solve this? But sometimes only God can solve our problems. And he can open the right door and close the door when he wants to. We have to have confidence that God knows what he's doing. Shirley graduated from Pasadena, studied at the University of Southern California, studied library science, was to be the new librarian in Bricketwood. We had nothing, just bare boards. She had to plan the whole library. She was a faculty member, one of the 8 faculty members. I was transferred as a student. Soon we were to marry. My first assignment in Glasgow, opened the church there, visited people we'd baptized on tours. I remember, these memories come to you from the past and you kind of forget. You anointed people and often you don't know what happens. I remember this family, Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell, and they brought their little son, Colin. He said, would you anoint my son, Mr. Jones? He's got these ugly warts all over his body. And I prayed for him and anointed him, and maybe 2 or 3 that day. And a couple of weeks later, went to the Sabbath service, and this little boy came running up to me. Look, Mr. Jones, look. I said, look? He said, look. And what do you mean, look? Look! I didn't know what I was looking for. He said, look. No warts. They all fell off in the bed this morning. The bed was full of warts, all fallen off his body that morning. So, these things are exciting memories, and we can forget them. You've got the entire book of Acts, which gives us the history of the New Testament church. We've got 28 chapters there talking about the first few decades of the church. We've got an autobiography, we've got memories, we've got people like me that go on too long, talking about the past. don't forget the past, because the hand of God is with his work and with his people. And if you're here, God is working with your mind. You're hearing and learning and reading more than you ever knew was possible. And if we're still here, God hasn't finished with us yet. He may be still chiseling away on the block to get us into shape. God wants us to remember our history.